blood dries brown. A chilling reality Alice Bennett learned not from late-night documentaries, but from a rusted iron handle buried deep behind the plaster of her new hallway. She thought she was buying a cheap sanctuary to start over. Instead, she purchased a tomb that had been holding its breath for 30 years. Nobody in the tight-knit community of Blackridge, Pennsylvania, wanted the property at 42 Ashburn Lane. For over a decade, the 3-story Victorian monstrosity sat rotting at the dead end of a cul-de-sac, its slate roof sagging under the weight of neglect, its overgrown rhododendrons swallowing the wraparound porch. Locals whispered about black mold, cracked foundations, and catastrophic plumbing. But Alice Bennett didn't care about the whispers. At 32, fresh off a devastating divorce from a man who had drained her bank accounts to fund a secret second life, Alice needed a miracle she could afford. Enter David O'Connor, a local real estate agent whose cheap suits and slicked-back hair screamed desperation. David had inherited the listing from his father, and the property had been a thorn in his side for years. When Alice walked into his office with a meager budget and a stubborn set to her jaw, David practically shoved the paperwork across his desk. He sold it to her for $24,000, cash. It was a price so absurdly low for a 4-bedroom house that it bordered on criminal. But Alice was too blinded by the prospect of a fresh start to look the gift horse in the mouth. The house had originally belonged to Arthur Sterling, a reclusive former clockmaker who died in the late 90s. Arthur had no next of kin, and the property eventually fell to the county before David's firm bought it at a tax auction. During the walkthrough, David hurried Alice through the rooms, aggressively masking the smell of decay with cheap vanilla room spray. "Solid bones," David had lied through his teeth, tapping a water-stained, load-bearing beam in the kitchen. "Just needs a little elbow grease, Alice. A woman with your vision? You'll have this place flipped or feeling like home in 6 months." Alice moved in on a suffocatingly humid Tuesday in August. Armed with a maxed-out Home Depot credit card, a crowbar, and sheer, unadulterated willpower, she began the grueling process of stripping the house down to its studs. The first few weeks were a blur of dust masks, splintered floorboards, and the endless screech of a reciprocating saw. She lived out of a single, unrenovated bedroom on the 2nd floor, surviving on instant noodles and the adrenaline of independence. But as September rolled in, bringing a bitter, premature chill to the Pennsylvania air, the house began to push back. It started with the drafts. Alice would seal a window, caulk the frames, and lay down weather stripping, yet she would still wake up freezing, feeling a phantom breeze sweeping across her face. Then came the architectural inconsistencies. Alice, an accountant by trade, possessed a mind wired for order and precision. To keep her renovations on track, she had tracked down the original 1920s blueprints from the county archives. One evening, while cross-referencing her measurements for new hardwood flooring, she noticed a glaring discrepancy. The first-floor layout featured a long, narrow hallway connecting the kitchen to the formal dining room. According to the blueprints, the hallway should have been 8 feet wide, but when Alice stretched her tape measure across the scuffed linoleum, it only read 5 feet. She blinked, exhausted, assuming she had misread the numbers. She measured again. 5 feet. Frowning, Alice walked to the adjacent room, Arthur Sterling's old study. She measured the interior wall. Then, she took her tape measure outside, tracing the exterior foundation. The math simply did not add up. There was a 3-foot void sitting dead in the center of the house, a massive column of space completely unaccounted for between the hallway and the study. "Maybe it's an old chimney chute," her older sister Sarah suggested over the phone later that night. Sarah had been begging Alice to abandon the project and move into her guest room in Boston. "Old houses have weird quirks, Alice. Ductwork, dumbwaiters, thick load-bearing structures. Don't let it drive you crazy. But Alice couldn't let it go. The house felt heavy, as if it were hiding a physical weight. That weekend, she invited a local contractor, a grizzled man named Richard Hayes, to give her a quote on rewiring the kitchen. While he was there, she pointed out the missing 3 feet. Richard tapped the plaster wall in the hallway with the hard end of his knuckles. Thud, thud. Then he moved a few feet down and tapped again. Thud, thunk. The sound shifted. It went from the solid resistance of wood studs to a hollow, resonant echo. "That's not ductwork," Richard muttered, shining his heavy-duty maglite against the peeling floral wallpaper. "And it ain't a chimney. Sounds like a dead space. People used to do this during Prohibition to hide liquor, or maybe the previous owner just framed over a closet to avoid fixing rot. If I were you, I'd leave it alone until you have the budget to deal with whatever structural mess is back there." Alice nodded, thanking him for his time. But the moment Richard's truck pulled out of her driveway, Alice walked straight to her toolbox. She didn't have the budget to hire professionals, but she had a 20-pound sledgehammer and a growing obsession. The destruction began at 9 p.m. Alice stood in the dimly lit hallway, her safety goggles strapped tight over her eyes, a heavy dust mask covering her nose and mouth. She positioned herself squarely in front of the hollow-sounding section of the wall. With a deep breath, she swung the sledgehammer. The impact sent a violent shockwave up her arms. The decades-old plaster shattered like brittle bone, sending a thick cloud of white, chalky dust billowing into the corridor. She swung again, harder this time. Crack! A jagged hole opened up in the wall, exposing the dry, splintered wooden lath beneath. Alice dropped the sledgehammer and grabbed her crowbar, violently ripping the wooden strips away. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, fueled by a strange mix of terror and exhilaration. As she pulled back the 3rd strip of lath, her crowbar struck something that didn't yield. Clang! It was the unmistakable, ringing sound of heavy metal. Alice froze. She wiped the sweat from her forehead, grabbing her flashlight from the floor. She shined the beam into the dusty, jagged opening. There, hidden completely behind the framed plaster, was a door. But it wasn't a standard interior wooden door. It was made of thick, riveted industrial steel, painted a dull, chipping grey. It looked like something salvaged from a naval submarine or a bank vault. "What the hell?" Alice breathed, the words muffled by her mask. Frantically, she tore away more plaster and lath, expanding the hole until she could see the entire frame. The steel door was set perfectly into the reinforced concrete of the home's original foundation. It had no handle. Instead, near the center, there was a heavy iron wheel, completely seized with dark brown rust and what looked unsettlingly like dried, oxidized blood. The door was padlocked shut with a massive, heavy-duty master lock that looked like it hadn't been touched since the Reagan administration. Alice's hands were shaking. Every rational instinct told her to call the police or to run out the front door and never look back. A hidden steel door padlocked from the outside meant only one thing. Someone was meant to be kept out, or worse, someone was meant to be kept in. But the stubborn independence that had carried her through a toxic marriage and a grueling divorce kept her feet planted on the floorboards. This was her house. She owned every inch of it, including whatever secrets Arthur Sterling had buried. She marched to the garage and retrieved an angle grinder she had bought to cut through rusted plumbing pipes. Plugging it into a heavy-duty extension cord, she returned to the hallway. The sparks flew in a brilliant, terrifying shower of orange and yellow as the spinning blade bit into the hardened steel of the padlock. The noise was deafening, a high-pitched mechanical scream that echoed through the empty, hollow house. After 5 agonizing minutes, the shackle snapped. Alice tossed the burning hot lock onto the floorboards, where it singed the old linoleum. She grabbed the rusted iron wheel. It was cold to the touch. She braced her boots against the baseboards and pulled with all her might. The wheel groaned, a horrible, metallic, screeching sound of metal scraping against metal. It didn't want to move. Alice readjusted her grip, throwing her entire body weight backward. With a loud crack, the seal broke. The wheel turned. Alice pulled the heavy steel door open. A rush of cold, stagnant air hit her face, carrying a smell she would never forget. A potent mixture of mildew, ozone, dried lavender, and something distinctly metallic. She shined her flashlight into the abyss. Beyond the door lay a narrow, steep staircase made of poured concrete, plunging downward into total darkness. It didn't lead to the main basement. Alice knew the main basement well. This was a separate, entirely undocumented subterranean level. "Hello?" Alice called out, her voice trembling. The silence that answered her was thick and absolute. Gripping her crowbar in one hand and her flashlight in the other, Alice began the descent. The air grew significantly colder with every step. At the bottom of the stairs, her flashlight beam swept across a large, cavernous room. Alice gasped, dropping her crowbar. It clattered loudly against the concrete floor. The room wasn't an empty, dusty cellar. It was a perfectly preserved, meticulously organized living space, frozen in time. Against the far wall sat a twin-sized mattress, fitted with faded floral sheets. Next to it was a small wooden desk, covered in neat stacks of spiral-bound notebooks, a battery-operated lantern, and an overturned mug. The walls were lined with custom-built shelving units, packed floor to ceiling with canned goods, bottled water, and first aid supplies, most of which had expiration dates from 1992. It was a fallout shelter. But as Alice stepped further into the room, sweeping her beam across the space, she realized it wasn't just built for survival. It was a cage. There was no handle on the inside of the steel door at the top of the stairs, and bolted securely to the concrete floor near the bed was a heavy iron ring attached to a thick, rusted chain. Alice felt the bile rise in her throat. She stumbled backward, bumping into a small, freestanding metal cabinet. The impact knocked a small wooden box off the top, spilling its contents across the dusty floor. Alice knelt, her breathing shallow and ragged. Among the scattered items, a few silver coins, a tarnished pocket watch, and a dried rose, was a Polaroid photograph. She picked it up, wiping away the layer of grime. The picture showed a young woman, perhaps early 20s, sitting on the very bed Alice was looking at. The woman's eyes were wide, terrified, staring directly into the lens. But it wasn't the fear that made Alice's blood run ice-cold. It was the heavy silver locket resting around the young woman's neck. It was a distinct, custom-made pendant shaped like a teardrop, engraved with a sprawling cursive B. Alice reached up, her trembling fingers wrapping around the exact same silver locket resting against her own collarbone. It was a family heirloom. The woman in the photo was her aunt, Margaret Bennett, who had vanished without a trace from a nearby college campus 34 years ago. The Polaroid slipped from Alice's trembling fingers, fluttering to the concrete floor like a dead autumn leaf. The air in the subterranean room suddenly felt too thick to breathe. The heavy silver locket around her neck, a gift from her father on her 18th birthday, handed down after his sister's disappearance, felt like it was burning a hole through her collarbone. Margaret Bennett, the ghost story of her family, the bright, ambitious journalism major at Penn State, who had walked out of a local diner one rainy Tuesday evening in October of 1992 and simply vanished off the face of the earth. For 34 years, Alice's family had been fractured by the unanswered questions. Her father had spent his life savings on private investigators. Her grandparents had died with broken hearts, always looking out the window for a daughter who was never coming home. And she had been here, buried beneath the floorboards of a house Alice had bought for $24,000. A violent shudder racked Alice's body. She scrambled backward, her boots scraping loudly against the concrete, and practically crawled up the steep, narrow stairs. She burst through the heavy steel door, gasping for the slightly less stale air of the hallway. Her hands shook so violently she dropped her phone twice before finally dialing 911. 911, what is your emergency? The dispatcher's calm, mechanical voice asked. I need the police, Alice choked out, leaning heavily against the exposed studs of the ripped-open wall. I'm at 42 Ashburn Lane. I found a room. A hidden room. There's a chain. And a picture of a missing person. Within 15 minutes, the quiet, overgrown cul-de-sac of Ashburn Lane was bathed in the harsh, strobing red and blue lights of 3 patrol cars. Blackridge was a sleepy Pennsylvania town. A call about a hidden bunker and a cold case victim brought out half the precinct. Alice sat on the edge of her dusty front porch, wrapped in a coarse wool blanket a paramedic had thrown over her shoulders, though she wasn't physically injured. The chill she felt was purely internal. She watched numbly as heavily armed officers cleared the house, followed shortly by a crime scene unit carrying heavy black cases. Detective William Bradley, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a deeply lined face and graying temples, approached her. He held a small, spiral-bound notebook, one of the journals Alice had seen on the desk in the bunker. Miss Bennet, Bradley said softly, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He offered reality. My team is processing the scene down there. We found human remains buried beneath a false floor under the mattress. Alice squeezed her eyes shut. A sharp, physical pain radiated through her chest. Is it her? Is it Margaret? We'll need to confirm with dental records and DNA, but given the photographic evidence and the personal effects down there, it is highly probable, Bradley replied gently. He looked down at the notebook in his gloved hand. You said you just bought this house? Last month, Alice whispered. From David O'Connor, the real estate agent. Bradley's brow furrowed slightly, a subtle tightening of the muscles around his eyes. David O'Connor, his father, Thomas O'Connor, used to handle estate liquidations for the county back in the 90s. Thomas was the one who processed this house when the original owner, Arthur Sterling, died. Alice looked up, her mind racing to connect the dots. Arthur Sterling was a clockmaker, an old reclusive man. How could an old man subdue my aunt and lock her in a reinforced concrete bunker without anyone noticing? That, Bradley said, his expression grim, is exactly what we are going to find out. Because I've skimmed the first few pages of this journal, Miss Bennet, your aunt didn't write about an old clockmaker. She wrote about a man she called T. For the next 48 hours, Alice wasn't allowed back inside her own home. She rented a cheap room at a nearby Motel 6, her sister Sarah flying in on a red-eye from Boston to sit with her on the stained floral bedspread, drinking bitter instant coffee in silence. The media had caught wind of the story. News vans camped out at the entrance of Ashburn Lane. Local woman discovers missing aunt in hidden dungeon of new home. The headlines were sensational, grotesque, and painfully real. On Thursday morning, Detective Bradley called Alice into the precinct. The station smelled of stale donuts and floor wax, a stark contrast to the sterile, terrifying nightmare unfolding in her life. Bradley ushered her and Sarah into a small conference room and slid a digitized copy of Margaret's journal across the table. "We rushed the forensics," Bradley explained, leaning against the doorframe. "It's Margaret. The remains match. I'm profoundly sorry, Alice." Alice placed a hand over her mouth, while Sarah let out a quiet, shattered sob. "I wanted you to see this before it leaks to the press," Bradley continued, tapping the printed pages. "Your aunt documented her time down there. She was alive in that room for exactly 42 days. She was abducted on October 14th, 1992. But it wasn't a random snatch off the street. She knew the man who took her." Alice pulled the pages toward her. The handwriting was elegant, looping cursive, so much like her own father's. October 16th, 1992. "He says I can't leave until the baby is born. He says it will ruin him, his wife, his firm, his reputation in this God-forsaken town. He brought me soup today. I threw it at the steel door. He just laughed. He pays the old deaf man upstairs to keep quiet. Arthur doesn't even know I'm down here. He just thinks T rents the basement for storage." Alice stopped reading, her blood turning to ice. The baby. Margaret had been pregnant. "Thomas O'Connor," Alice breathed, looking up at the detective. "T is Thomas O'Connor, David's father." Bradley nodded slowly. "We pulled Thomas O'Connor's old financial records from the 90s. He was deeply in debt, leveraging his real estate firm on bad commercial investments. A scandal, an affair with a 21-year-old college student resulting in a pregnancy, would have destroyed his marriage to the heir of the town's largest bank. He couldn't afford a divorce. So he silenced her." "He locked her in a tomb and let her die?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling with rage. "According to the later entries, Margaret developed a severe fever," Bradley said, his voice tightening. "An infection, likely related to the pregnancy. Thomas stopped bringing food. He panicked. He locked the steel door from the outside, paid off the back taxes on Arthur Sterling's property so the bank wouldn't foreclose and inspect it, and let nature take its course." Alice felt sick. The O'Connor family had built an empire in Blackridge on the bones of her aunt. And the most sickening twist of all, Thomas's son, David, was the one who had practically given Alice the house. "Does David know?" Alice demanded, standing up from the table. "David sold me the house for $24,000 cash. He bypassed inspections. He told me to just paint over the walls and flip it fast. He wanted me to unknowingly bury the evidence forever." "We are bringing David O'Connor in for questioning," Bradley said. "We suspect he found out about his father's secret recently, perhaps going through Thomas's private ledgers after Thomas passed away last year. David needed to offload the liability. Selling it dirt cheap to a desperate, cash-strapped out-of-towner who didn't have the budget for deep structural renovations was his way of covering his family's tracks." Alice didn't wait for the police to act. The grief and shock that had paralyzed her for 2 days suddenly hardened into a sharp, blinding fury. David O'Connor had looked her in the eye, smiled his slick salesman smile, and handed her the keys to her own family's graveyard. She left the precinct, ignoring Sarah's pleas to go back to the motel, and drove straight to O'Connor Realty on Main Street. The bell above the glass door chimed brightly as Alice pushed her way inside. The office was decorated in rich mahogany and leather, a monument to the O'Connor family's wealth. David was standing behind the reception desk, packing files frantically into a leather briefcase. He looked up as Alice entered. The color drained from his face instantly. The slick, confident demeanor was gone, replaced by the panicked, sweaty look of a trapped animal. "Alice," he stammered, taking a step back. "The police, they just called my lawyer. I had no idea, Alice. You have to believe me. I didn't know what was down there." "You're a liar," Alice said, her voice eerily calm, though her hands were balled into fists so tight her nails bit into her palms. She walked slowly toward his desk. "You knew the square footage didn't match the blueprints. You knew there was an unregistered padlocked door behind the plaster. You sold me a crime scene to save your trust fund." "I didn't kill her," David shouted, his voice cracking defensively. "My father did. My father was a monster. I only found his diaries a month ago when we cleared out his safe deposit box. He wrote about the house. He wrote about what he did to a girl named Margaret. I panicked, Alice. If the police dug up the property, the lawsuits would bankrupt the firm. My kids would have nothing." Alice stared at the pathetic man cowering behind his expensive desk. He hadn't swung the hammer, and he hadn't locked the padlock, but he had inherited his father's cowardice. He valued a real estate firm over a human life. "You tried to make me an accomplice to hiding my own aunt's murder," Alice said quietly. The pure venom in her tone made David flinch. Before David could offer another miserable excuse, the chime above the door rang again. Detective Bradley stepped into the office, accompanied by 2 uniformed officers. Bradley didn't look at David. He kept his eyes respectfully on Alice. "Ms. Bennett, please step away from the desk," Bradley instructed gently. He turned to David, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. "David O'Connor, you are under arrest for the tampering of physical evidence, obstruction of justice, and illegal concealment of human remains." David didn't fight. He slumped over the mahogany desk, weeping into his hands as the officers read him his rights and marched him out into the harsh daylight of Main Street. Alice stood in the empty office, listening to the sirens fade into the distance. The crushing weight that had sat on her chest since the moment she swung that sledgehammer finally began to lift. It wasn't closure. She knew grief was a ghost that never truly vacated the premises, but it was an ending. The truth, buried beneath concrete and rust for 34 years, had finally clawed its way to the surface. 2 months later, the yellow police tape was finally removed from 42 Ashburn Lane. The structural engineers had come and gone, assessing the damage Alice had done to the load-bearing walls. Her sister Sarah begged her to sell the property, to take the impending settlement money from the O'Connor estate and move back to Boston. But Alice refused. She had run from a broken marriage, and she had run from a life that didn't fit her anymore. She wasn't going to run from this house. On a crisp November morning, Alice stood in the center of the hallway. The wall was fully repaired, framed with fresh, fragrant pine studs and smooth new drywall. Behind it, the heavy steel door had been removed entirely by the police. The basement itself had been professionally sanitized and permanently filled with poured concrete, sealing the dark history of Arthur Sterling's home forever. Alice ran her hand along the smooth, freshly painted wall. She wore the silver locket on the outside of her sweater now, a quiet tribute to the woman who had fought in the dark, writing down the truth so that one day someone might hear her. Alice picked up a roller loaded with warm, bright yellow paint and pressed it against the fresh drywall. She was going to finish what she started. She was going to bring light back to the house on Ashburn Lane. The house on Ashburn Lane no longer holds its breath. Alice didn't sell it. Instead, she finished the renovations, transforming the dark, oppressive architecture into a space flooded with light. The basement was permanently sealed, a tomb closed with respect, while Margaret's remains were finally laid to rest in the family plot. Sometimes, the only way to heal a deep wound is to tear down the walls hiding it.